This is the first Sunday in Lent. This past Wednesday was Ash Wednesday. This is a season of preparation for Easter. That's what Lent is. And so we're beginning our new sermon series for Lent, 24 Hours That Changed the World. We're studying the last 24 hours of Jesus' life up through his crucifixion. And you know it's common for somebody to give up something for Lent. Not everybody does that. Some do. I am this year. I am giving up social media for Lent. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and let me tell you what, I am strangely happy. I have this tendency, I don't know about you, but I have this tendency to almost be chained to my phone. Like who posted what on my Facebook page? Like, did they comment? Who liked that post I made? Or like, how many Twitter followers do I have? And so I've noticed this tendency in myself, and I haven't looked at it since Wednesday, and I am strangely happy. Now, I am seeing less pictures of puppies and cats, which is a trade-off, and so you have to, is it worth it or not? But my hope is that through this Lenten season, I will be a little more human and a little less iPhone. And I'm already feeling that. And thank you. I'm already feeling that. And so if you are, as a part of your spiritual journey, if you are giving up something for Lent or maybe gaining something for Lent, kudos to you, and I wish you success in that. And hopefully this series will help as well. So the last 24 hours of Jesus' life comprise the Last Supper, which we're talking about today, and we're going to take communion again later. Even though we took it last week, we're going to break from our tradition and take communion again today. And then after that, Jesus was arrested. He was betrayed by Judas and arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. And then he was tried that night and then crucified, tortured and crucified the next day, which we call Good Friday. And so we're going to look at the events of Jesus' life during this series, and hopefully from a perspective that honors the historical context. You might learn some new details that you hadn't heard before. And most importantly, as we look at the last 24 hours of Jesus' life, my guess is all of us are going to be able to find ourselves in his story, and perhaps in surprising ways. And we may realize that, in a completely different world that he lived in, technologically, and in the kinds of pressures that we face, we may find ourselves as kind of like one of the characters in this 24 hours story. Or maybe we can identify with some things that Jesus felt or was experiencing, or maybe somebody else was feeling or experiencing. And perhaps it could be even life-changing for us in surprising ways. So that's where we're headed during this series. And we begin on at sunset of Thursday evening. Jesus shared a meal with his disciples. They had spent all day on the Mount of Olives, which is a kind of a low mountain range right outside of Jerusalem, except for Peter and John, who had been preparing the Passover meal. The Passover Seder, actually, it was called in the Jewish tradition, and they were all Jews. And this is an annual holy day in the Jewish faith. And so Jerusalem is a dry place, not quite as dry as here, but when you're walking all day on a mountain and you get to a place where you're going to have dinner, the tradition is that somebody, a servant or a slave, is going to have a basin and a pitcher, and they're going to wash your dirty, sweaty feet before dinner time. And so as all the disciples pile in to this place that we call the upper room now, probably the second story room in the home of a wealthy person outside of, or actually next to the temple in Jerusalem for this dinner. All the disciples must have looked at each other's dirty, nasty feet and then seen that water basin and that pitcher and just slowly backed away. I want nothing, there's no servant around here to wash feet, so I want nothing to do with that job. And Jesus must have taken notice of that. And then as they entered the room, they found a table that looked something like this. Of course, when we think of a table, we think of a high table and chairs, but that's not the kind of table that Jesus and his disciples shared the Last Supper at. This is what was called a Roman triclinium. Tri meaning three. So it's a three-sided, U-shaped table that is low to the ground, no chairs. And perhaps there were cushions around the three sides of the table. There's an open space so the servant or the slave could get in the middle and serve food to all the guests. And a high percentage of Roman society were slaves. But there is no slave, no servant here, not an official one at least, in the Last Supper. And the way it works was all of the guests around the triclinium would recline, supporting themselves on their left elbows with their feet away from the table. And they would eat with their right hands. And so you're kind of lying back to back around this table. And there were positions. So there was the position of the host. There was the position of honor. There's kind of a numbered hierarchy around the table. And a host would seat his guests according to their importance to him. And of course, he would keep beloved friends close. And there was also a seat of honor across from the guest, the host of the dinner. And so the disciples would have eaten the Last Supper together around a triclinium, something like this. It's a lot different than the scene we're used to seeing, right? Which the Last Supper painted by Leonardo DiCaprio, right? No, Da Vinci, correct? And they're all on one side of the table. It looks like a perfect Instagram shot, all set up. This is just very different from that, but this is probably what the Last Supper looked like. And like we said, this was a Passover Seder, an annual holy meal shared by the Jewish people. And the Seder is meant to dramatize what is the central defining event in the life of the Jewish people. It's the Exodus. And remember, the Jewish people, the Israelites, were slaves in Egypt. Pharaoh kept them as slaves. And who went to Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go"? Who was that? Moses. And so God delivers through a series of miraculous events, 10 plagues. God delivers the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. He sets them free. He liberates them. So the Passover Seder is a reenactment of this act of liberation, of freedom, that God has freed his people from bondage, from slavery. And so somehow, in sharing this meal together with his disciples, the first followers of Jesus saw Jesus as the fulfillment of the Passover. That somehow my experience of Jesus, my relationship with Jesus, somehow liberates me, frees me in some way that we'll talk about later on. So let's read a few verses from Luke chapter 22, this is 14 through 27, about what's happening here in the Passover Seder. When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined, right? They reclined at the table, the triclinium. And he said to them, "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God." After taking the cup, he gave thanks and said, "Take this and divide it among you. For I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." And he took bread, gave thanks and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. But the hand of him who is going to betray me is with mine on the table. The Son of Man," that's how Jesus refers to himself. It means human one, actually. It's just a kind of a foreign concept that comes from the book of Daniel in the Hebrew Bible. "The Son of Man will go as it has been decreed. But woe to that, woe to that man who betrays him." They began to question among themselves which one of them it might be who would do this, who would betray him. A dispute also arose among them as to which of them was considered to be the greatest. "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors, but you are not to be like that," Jesus says to them. "Instead, the greatest among you should be like the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves, like a servant, a slave. For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? Is it not the one who is at the table? But I am among you," Jesus says, "as one who serves." So this past Wednesday, Ash Wednesday, I had the privilege of having lunch with my buddy, Rabbi Shmuley. And last time I saw him, I told him that I wanted to have lunch at his favorite kosher restaurant, wherever that was. And so he said, "Okay, it's going to be Fresh Mint," a restaurant called Fresh Mint in Scottsdale, like Thunderbird and Scottsdale Road. And Shmuley is a vegan. And so Fresh Mint is a Vietnamese vegetarian restaurant that's been certified kosher by a board of rabbis in the Scottsdale area. So we showed up, and as always, when we had the Sabbath dinner at his house and he told us he was a vegan, I wonder, do I need to eat before I go? Like, what do I expect here? And so we got to Fresh Mint, and had a great menu, and I ordered Mongolian soy beef. Like, so you know the Mongolian beef dish, you can get it in any Asian place. Mongolian soy beef, so it's not real beef, it's soy beef. You ready for the verdict? First of all, number one, I would have been fooled had nobody told me. I would have thought that the soy beef was real beef, number one. Number two, are you ready for this? It's the best Mongolian beef dish I've ever had in my life. I promise you. Like, the flavoring of the dish, it was so good. It was absolutely delicious. And so we're just enjoying lunch at this vegetarian place. And I emailed him a couple days before, and I said, I'm giving a sermon on the Last Supper this Sunday, and it's, of course, the Passover Seder. Would you mind taking a couple of minutes if we could shoot a video at the restaurant of you talking about what the Passover Seder means to Jews? And so we just found a little corner, and during this video, a plane flies overhead. It's close to the Scottsdale airport. People are coming out of some store laughing, and so it's an informal video. But here's Shmuley talking for 2 to 3 minutes about what the Passover Seder means to the Jewish community. So here's the rock star rabbi, Shmuley Yanklowitz. Let's watch.
The Passover Seder is one of my favorite experiences every year. It's not only wonderful to be with family and friends and have a celebratory meal, but the deep religious roots of the Seder speak to me. We read the Haggadah, the book telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt. We have 4 cups of wine or grape juice, talking about liberation. We have the horseradish talking about the suffering. We, of course, have matzah to talk about the leaving of Egypt in haste. And so much of this ritual is about liberation. It's about freedom on a collective level, global, cosmic, on an individual level, finding our own freedom and liberation from our own suffering and false misconceptions. And so the Seder itself is not only a particular story about the Jewish people, the Israelites coming out of bondage, becoming a people approaching Har Sinai, Mount Sinai, to get the revelation of the Torah, of the Bible, and moving towards Israel, towards the Promised Land. But it's also a universalistic story, which is about the potential to connect to God and connect to humanity through redemption, through each day committing to redeem the worker who is oppressed, to redeem the slave, to redeem anyone who is crying out from suffering. The Passover Seder comes and says, remember that you too were a slave. Remember that you too were a foreigner. Remember that you too were a wanderer. And thus, wherever you go in your journeys, you must defend the wanderer. You must defend the slave. You must defend the oppressed. And the Seder has deep connection to the Last Supper, that our Christian brethren with deep bonds to the Jews also have the Last Supper, which represents salvation, redemption, freedom in a different context. But I think Jews and Christians can come together around this theme of the Last Supper and the Seder to think together about how we can partner our two covenants together as spiritual communities to bring social justice, liberation, and redemption to the world. Because ultimately what we learn from the Seder experience is that belief in God is not enough. To believe in the Exodus, to believe in divine redemption means we must act. We must act to bring redemption into the world each day. I wish Jews and Christians a happy Easter, a happy Passover, and may these occasions lead us to partnership to bring redemption to society.
Because of the noise, he's like, do you want to shoot it again? I'm like, no, dude, that was perfect. You nailed it. One take Shmuley. So the Passover Seder is about liberation, freedom. And the first followers of Jesus see Jesus in that story as bringing liberation of freedom. Now, here's a question for us that we'll talk about the rest of our time here. Freed from what? I mean, we're not slaves. We're not slaves in Egypt anymore. We're not a slave at our job. You can quit and get a new job. None of us are slaves. We're not servants. You know, are we in bondage somehow? Are we, what do we need to be freed from? So during this Lent, if we're reading the last 24 hours of Jesus' life and we're finding ourselves in a story, here's a question. What do I need to be freed from? What do you need to be freed from? Luke gives us some hints about what that might be in your life, in my life, and in everybody's life in the human experience. Remember what the disciples argue about in verse 24. So they've been traveling with Jesus for at least months. Depends on how, the Gospels and how you read them as to how long Jesus' ministry lasted. And so on the night of the Last Supper, he's getting ready to be betrayed and crucified. They're arguing about which one is the greatest disciple. Can you imagine the giant face palm Jesus had to do during the last? He's like, have you not heard anything I have said to you? Have you ever felt like that? When you just, have you been listening at all when I talked about loving your neighbors and humbleness and acting out, for the welfare of other people, and now you guys are arguing about which one is the greatest. Which one is the greatest humble follower of Jesus, right? And so there's this exercise in missing the point. And the disciples reveal in this argument about who is the greatest that perhaps you and I can be enslaved by a desire to be something, special, better than other people. We can be enslaved by a desire for status, enslaved by a desire, really that's rooted in pride, to somehow be better than other people, to think we're more important than other people, to think of our needs before we think of the needs of other people, to be consumed with what I want and who I am and my comfort and my happiness in life, giving no thought to somebody else's. I don't know if that describes you or not, but that describes me pretty well, actually. That perhaps we can be enslaved to a desire for power and status. Every single day, I see the aftermath of this dispute among humanity. My day job is I'm the development director at Chandler Christian Community Center. And so we're located in the barrio in Chandler, and yes, there is one. A lot of people don't know there is one. It's hidden. And so there's just an enormous amount of poverty around us. 25 to 40% of the people in that area live in poverty. It's shocking to most people who live in Chandler and Gilbert. And it's 1 block away from like the new swanky downtown Chandler. And so I can walk out into the lobby and I see people, many of whom are struggling with mental illness. And that's the defining story of their lives. It enslaves them. They're struggling with mental illness, and many were born in the cycle of poverty. They were born in it. They haven't known anything different. It was said of one politician, he was born on third base and grew up thinking he hit a triple. And these people, they were born with 2 strikes against them, and now they're facing a 95-mile-an-hour fastball. And so it's just very, very difficult for a lot of those people to break out of the cycle of poverty. And then I can walk 1 block away and be at some cool, swanky restaurant for lunch in downtown Chandler. There's a new luxury high-rise apartment building going up with like swimming pools on the roof or something, and then I can see the beautiful Chandler City Hall as soon as I walk out the door. And it's like any urban area, right? Like you can have like the opulent right next to the impoverished, just smashed up against each other. And it shows this struggle for power and status in our society, that there are those who have it, and then there are those who don't, and who bear the weight of that power and that status. And after seeing that, I have to ask myself, what role do I play in that? How am I enslaved to a desire for power and status and image management and wanting people to think I'm something I'm not, better than I am, right? How am I enslaved? How do I need to be freed? So I can read this story and I can think, wow, I need to be liberated. I need to be delivered. I need to be set free in all kinds of ways, thinking I'm the greatest, right? Now, the plot thickens because there was somebody at the table who knew he wasn't the greatest. Because Luke and the other Gospels tell us that right before this dinner, he had a conversation with some people in authority who hated Jesus. They saw Jesus as a threat. In this society, it was a theocracy. The religion and the government were mixed, so you could be imprisoned or killed for your religious activities. And he had made a deal with these people right before the dinner that he would betray Jesus. They couldn't arrest him when crowds were around because he was popular. And so they needed to find a place where they could arrest him in seclusion. And he said to them, I know where he hangs out. And you can come at night when there are no crowds around, and I'll give you a sign of friendship, actually. I'll kiss him on the cheek, which in a Mediterranean culture is a way of greeting a friend. And that way you'll know that it's him, and you can take him. Of course, that person was Judas. We know that Judas was the treasurer. He kept the money for Jesus Incorporated, Jesus and his disciples. The Gospel of John tells us that sometimes Judas stole money from the money bag. So we know that money was very, very important to Judas. He always wanted more. He probably did pretty well, but he always wanted more. I think it was asked of John D. Rockefeller one time, how much is enough? How much money do you want? And he said something to the effect of $1 more. Always $1 more. It's just never enough. Money was very, very important to Judas. And he always felt this compulsion that he needed more. Somehow he needed more. He needed to be upwardly mobile. He needed more. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26, tells us that the deal Jesus made was that he would betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. We know what that was valued at in this time in the Roman culture. And for us now in 21st century America, that would be about $10,000, about 10 grand. So how much was Jesus' life worth to Judas? A used car, about 10 grand. And there's been a lot of speculation about why would Judas betray Jesus? What, was he just evil? Was he a sociopath? What happened? The theory that I find most compelling was that Judas betrayed Jesus because of his political ideology. One of the political factions in this time was a party called the Zealots. You can tell, they were zealous. They were a fiery, passionate group of people. And the Zealots were somebody who resented the Roman occupation. The Romans had militarily occupied what is now Israel, where this is taking place. And the Zealots were essentially a violent group who wanted to violently overthrow the Romans and kick them out of Palestine, who wanted to overthrow them. And so they were always on the lookout for heroes who could be military leaders and lead some kind of operative against the Romans and kick them out. That was their political ideology. We want action, we want violence, we want toughness, we want strength. They would have loved the pictures of Vladimir Putin with his shirt off that he's shared with the Russian people everywhere. And they just wanted to overthrow the Romans. Perhaps this is what Judas thought Jesus would be. When he first met Jesus and he heard this fiery prophet and this passionate teaching and somebody who has charisma and authority, perhaps Judas thought that Jesus would be this kind of violent military leader. And he realized, probably didn't take very long, that's not who Jesus is going to be. I'm hearing this lovey-dovey stuff, this turn the other cheek stuff, this nonviolent stuff, this peace stuff. And Judas, he keeps the money bag and he goes along with it for a certain amount of time until eventually he decides, this guy's a loser. I didn't give up months of my life to follow a weak leader who's not going to do anything about the Romans, so I'm just going to cut my losses. And because of his political ideology, he figures 10 grand is enough, okay, and this guy can kind of do what he wants, and I'll cut my losses and make a little money on this. Perhaps what Judas was enslaved by was a love of money and his political ideology. Man, it's a good thing that has nothing to do with 21st century America, right? And so I have to ask myself, wow, am I somehow enslaved by financial anxiety and the desire for $1 more? Do I fall into the Southeast Valley vortex that it's never enough? Bigger house, better cars, more granite countertops, more stainless steel. Am I in the Southeast Valley mentality that it's just never, ever, ever, ever enough? Never enough promotions, never enough raises, more, all the time. That was the life Judas lived. Am I enslaved to my political ideology? I have strong political opinions. If you ask me, I'll tell you. Right? If you make the mistake of asking me, I'll tell you. And so I have strong political opinions, but I have to ask myself, okay, like Judas, do my political opinions tempt me to act violently towards other people? And I don't just mean physical violence, I mean verbal violence. Like I'll say, that person needs beaten in the election. That's violent language, isn't it? Beaten. Right? Or do I demonize people who disagree with me, who have a different viewpoint than me, or who post different Facebook posts than I post? Am I a slave to my political ideology? Does it push me down a path that is not the Jesus path? The love of money and political ideology. Do I need to be freed from those things? How about you? The last way that we can find ourselves in this Last Supper story is what we encounter in the 13th chapter of John's Gospel when John tells us that as they were reclining at the table, Jesus announced that one of them would betray him, like he does here in Luke, but he does something in John that he doesn't do in Luke. He dips the sop, which is kind of an ancient way of saying he took a piece of bread and he dipped it in either wine or oil and vinegar, and then he handed it to someone. So if you go to Olive Garden or Buca de Beppo, right, you dip bread in this vinegar and oil mixture, and in the ancient world, the host of the meal dipping that bread in this mixture and then handing it to somebody was a sign of honor. It was like, I'm going to serve you first. I'm honoring you, and I'm thankful for your presence here. And everybody at the dinner can see that I hold you in high esteem. I am recognizing your dignity, and I'm giving you something that I'm not giving to the other people around the table. By dipping this bread and handing it to you, I'm honoring you. And who does Jesus give that to? Judas. And so as they're all sitting around the table, and we talked a few weeks ago about how it's Jesus who washed their feet. There was no servant, there was no slave. Jesus got the pitcher in the basin, and he sat down with a towel, and he washed their feet. He took on the job of a servant. And there's this person who's going to betray him, who certainly could be categorized as his enemy. And what he does is he honors the person who is going to betray him. Now, another little detail, if you remember back to the triclinium picture, we're told, we can kind of deduce by putting these different clues together in the gospel, that Jesus, of course, is sitting in the host's seat. Next to him is John, who was probably a really young guy at this point. And he kind of leans back and talks to Jesus. That's how we know John is to Jesus' right, because he can kind of lean back and talk to him. And you're reclining on your left hand, or your left elbow, and to dip the sop, to dip that bread and to give that to somebody, it doesn't say he got up and walked around the table. It just says he handed it to him. So, John's here, and Jesus is here. I'll put myself in the place of Jesus. That's gross, isn't it? And then, so where's Judas? He's next to him, isn't he? He's next to him in a place of honor. So you've heard the statement, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. And that's strategy. But here we find, for some reason, Jesus has given Judas a place of honor. And he dips the bread and he hands it to him. It was really honoring the guy. And why did Jesus do that? You could do that to shame somebody, like I know what you're up to, and now I'm going to make you feel really bad. Could be. Wouldn't be anything wrong with that, would there be? Or it could have been yet another lesson to his disciples. Here's how you treat somebody who acts in a way towards you that makes that person your enemy. Here's how you treat somebody who's going to betray you. Here's how you treat somebody who hurts you. Now, I'm not talking about abuse. If you're being abused, you need to get away. I'm not talking about boundaries. There are times where you have to set boundaries in life. But there are lots of examples in life of interactions that we have with people that do hurt deeply. And if you're like me, your tendency is to withdraw, to write that person off, to stonewall. Correct? Am I the only one? Get away from that person, avoid, deny. There's no problem here, and just get away from it. And that's just the opposite of what Jesus does with Judas. Keeps him close, gives him something that honors him. And then Judas runs out at that point. He leaves. And he goes and he meets them later in the Garden of Gethsemane. So when I read the story, I have to ask myself, how do I treat my enemies? The people I consider to be my enemies, people who have hurt me, how do I treat them? Do I hate them? Do I write them off? Do I stonewall? Do I avoid them? Or am I willing to somehow overcome those feelings and see myself in that person, to see a human being with dignity, with honor, in that person? And am I willing to extend the olive branch, so to speak? Am I willing to acknowledge the humanity in that person, our common humanity? Is that how I treat my enemies? Do I need to be set free from revenge and bitterness and hatred? That really just eats me up inside. Even if they don't know I feel that way, it hurts me. That's one of the ways I find myself in this story. There's a lack of love in our culture, isn't there? It seems like our culture is getting more and more unloving. And there are a lot of people who claim to follow Jesus who certainly don't show a lot of love towards others in our cultures, others in our culture. They act in ways that are the opposite of love. They don't keep the person near and give them honor. They seem to dishonor people, to take away the dignity of people, not acknowledge it. Look at this quote attributed to Cory Booker. You may not be able to read it. It's kind of a small font, but I'll read it for you. He says this to religious people: before you speak to me about your religion, first show it to me in how you treat other people. Before you tell me how much you love your God, show me in how much you love all his children. Before you preach to me of your passion for your faith, teach me about it through your compassion for your neighbors. In the end, I'm not as interested in what you have to tell or sell as I am in how you choose to live and give. Doesn't that just about hit the nail on the head? Boom. Right? What more needs to be said? So as I read the Last Supper, I'm challenged to live, to be set free, and to choose to love in the way this quote represents. In his Christmas Eve sermon in 1967, 3 months before he was assassinated, Martin Luther King Jr. Spoke of people who hold on to hate. They hold on to racism. And this is how he responded to them. He said, "We will still love you. Be assured, we will wear you down by our capacity to suffer. And we will win you in the process, and our victory will be double." That's a Last Supper way of approaching those who hate you, isn't it? Of treating your enemies. That's a person who's free, who's liberated from grudges, liberated from hatred, liberated from the desire for revenge, liberated from image management and just looking cool and tough because I can have the upper hand. That's somebody who's liberated from those things and is truly free. And so the Last Supper is rooted in the Jewish Passover Seder that speaks of liberation, freedom, new possibilities, hope, inspiration, that we can be free from our ideology. Well, we can still hold strong opinions, but we don't have to demonize people who disagree with us. And we can be free from the love of money, that we don't have to be trapped in this hamster wheel, this rat race of always feeling like I have to earn one more dollar. And I can be freed from this cycle of revenge and violent rhetoric and hatred and bitterness, that we really can be free. So as we start our Lenten journey together, maybe we can start it with a newfound sense of freedom.